In 1944, the German army in Italy was fighting a defensive masterclass. Entrenched in the mountains of the Gustav Line, the elite Fallschirmjäger, paratroopers, looked down on the Allied armies with a mix of professional respect and racial disdain. They respected the Americans for their artillery. They respected the British for their stubbornness. But when they saw the regiments of small, brown-skinned men arriving from the east, the Nazi indoctrination kicked in. The German officers dismissed the Gurkhas. Colonial troops, they sneered. Auxiliaries. To the Aryan mindset of the SS and the Wehrmacht leadership, these men from Nepal were to mention subhumans. They believed that such soldiers might be useful for carrying crates or digging ditches, but they couldn't possibly stand up to the modern, mechanized might of the German soldier. German intelligence reports described the Gurkhas as mountain bandits who were ill-equipped for modern warfare. They noted their lack of heavy weapons. They noted their small stature. The average Gurkha was barely 5 feet 3 inches tall. A German grenadier stood nearly 6 feet tall, armed with an milligram 42 and a Panzerfaust. The mismatch seemed comical to the Germans. They assumed that when the shelling started, these primitive troops would panic and run. They assumed that loud noises and heavy tanks would break their morale. This racism created a tactical blind spot. The Germans were preparing for a war of machines. They were watching the roads for Sherman tanks. They were watching the skies for Spitfires. They weren't watching the shadows. They didn't realize that by underestimating the Gurkhas, they were inviting a predator into their trenches that operated on a level of violence they had forgotten existed. They viewed the Gurkhas as a relic of the British Empire's past. They were about to learn that the Gurkhas were actually the most dangerous infantry in the world. To understand why the German assessment was so fatally wrong, one must understand who the Gurkhas were. They were not conscripts. They were warriors born in the high Himalayas of Nepal. For a Gurkha, soldiering wasn't a job, it was a calling. It was the only way to escape the poverty of the hills and earn honor for their family. The selection process was brutal. Thousands of young men would trek for days just to get to the recruiting station. Only the strongest, the fittest, and the sharpest were chosen by the British officers, Gala Wallahs. They were raised in thin air, walking up and down mountains every day of their lives. Their stamina was superhuman. While a German soldier dragged himself up an Italian hillside, gasping for breath under his heavy pack, a Gurkha could run up the same hill with a smile. But their greatest attribute was their mindset. The Gurkha motto is, Kafa hunu banda mernu ramro, better to die than be a coward. This wasn't just a slogan. It was a code of conduct woven into their DNA. A Gurkha would not retreat unless ordered. He would not surrender. The Germans were used to fighting Western conscripts, men who wanted to go home, men who would surrender if the situation became hopeless. The Gurkha didn't recognize hopeless. If he ran out of bullets, he used stones. If he ran out of stones, he used his knife. The Germans sought small men. They didn't see the centuries of martial tradition. They didn't see the absolute lack of fear. They were about to fight men who treated combat not as a tragedy, but as a sport. When the Gurkhas arrived in Italy, they looked at the Apennine Mountains, the terrible terrain that had stalled the Americans, and they laughed. "These are not mountains," they said. "These are hills." To the Germans, the terrain was an obstacle. To the Gurkhas, It was home. Every army has a symbol. For the Gurkhas, it is the kukri. It is not a knife. It is not a machete. It is a weapon of decapitation. The blade is about 16 to 18 inches long. It curves forward, heavily weighted toward the tip. This forward curve gives it the physics of an axe combined with the slice of a sword. A standard straight bayonet is a thrusting weapon. You have to push it in and pull it out. It takes effort. The kukri is a chopping weapon. When a Gurkha swings it, momentum takes over. The blade bites deep. It can cleave through a helmet. It can sever an arm with a single blow. The Germans carried bayonets, but they rarely used them. They preferred to shoot. They considered hand-to-hand combat a last resort, something messy and desperate. For the Gurkha, the kukri was the primary weapon for close quarters. They sharpened them constantly. They treated them with reverence. There is a myth that a Gurkha must draw blood every time he unsheathes his kukri. While largely a myth, it speaks to the psychological dread the weapon inspires. The Germans had never faced a weapon like this. They were used to the mechanical noise of war, the rattle of machine guns, the boom of artillery. They were not prepared for the silent horror of the blade. The kukri didn't jam. It didn't run out of ammo. It didn't give away your position with a muzzle flash. It was the ultimate stealth weapon. And the Gurkhas were masters of stealth. They could crawl through dry leaves without making a sound. They could slip into a trench, cut a throat, and move to the next man before the body hit the floor. The German officers who mocked the primitive knife were about to find their sentries dead at their posts, with heads nearly severed from their bodies. The kukri was the answer to the high-tech German war machine. It was ancient, brutal, and terrified the master race more than any tank. Early 1944. Monte Cassino. The Allied advance in Italy had slammed into a brick wall. The historic monastery of Monte Cassino sat atop a steep mountain, dominating the Liri Valley. The Germans had turned the mountain into a fortress. The slopes were covered in mines, wire, and bunkers. The Fallschirmjäger holding the ruins were the toughest soldiers in the German army. The Allies threw everything at it. They bombed the monastery into rubble, a controversial decision. They sent American tanks. They sent New Zealand infantry. They sent Indian divisions. Everything failed. The tanks couldn't climb the scree slopes. The infantry was mowed down by machine guns firing from rock crevices. It was a stalemate. A meat grinder. The German commander, General Kesselring, felt secure. He believed the position was impregnable. No army can climb these slopes under fire, the German staff concluded. Desperate, the Allied command turned to the 1st Battalion, 9th Gurkha Rifles. Their mission was suicide, capture Hangman's Hill, a rocky outcrop just below the monastery walls. It was an exposed, isolated pimple of rock, completely surrounded by German positions. The Germans watched the Gurkhas moving up the line. They saw the small men, carrying heavy packs, moving steadily up the goat tracks. The German machine gunners opened fire. They expected the attack to crumble. But the Gurkhas didn't stop. They didn't dive for cover and stay there. They scuttled from rock to rock, moving faster than the Germans could adjust their aim. They infiltrated the German lines. The Germans realized too late that the terrain, which stopped the tanks, was providing cover for the Gurkhas. The small stature of the Gurkhas, the very thing the Germans had mocked, became their greatest asset. A Gurkha could hide behind a rock that would leave a German or American exposed. They slipped through the cracks in the German defense. By the time the sun rose, the Germans were shocked to find that the Gurkhas were not dead at the bottom of the hill. They were on top of Hangman's Hill, digging in right under the nose of the monastery. The Germans had assumed the position was unassailable. They had forgotten that they were fighting men who grew up on the roof of the world. As the stalemate at Casino dragged on, the battle shifted to the night. And the night belonged to the Gurkhas. The German Fallschirmjäger were used to aggressive patrolling. They would send out small teams to probe the Allied lines. But against the Gurkhas, the German patrols simply vanished. The Gurkhas practiced a form of psychological warfare that terrified the Wehrmacht. They would slip into no man's land in the pitch black. They didn't wear helmets, they wore soft slouch hats or wrapped cloth around their heads to hear better. They didn't wear heavy boots, they wore sneakers or walked barefoot to feel the ground. They would crawl right up to the German foxholes. There are many legends about what happened next. Some are myths, but the German fear was real. Stories circulated in the German mess halls that Gurkhas would sneak into a dugout, feel the boots of the sleeping soldiers to determine if they were German or Allied, by the laces, and then slit the throats of the enemy without waking the man next to him. Other stories claimed they would cut off the ears of sentries as trophies. Whether true or exaggerated, the effect was the same: paranoia. German sentries were terrified to close their eyes. They fired at shadows. They wasted ammunition shooting at rustling leaves. They knew that the Gurkhas were out there, invisible and silent. One German officer wrote home, "It is impossible to hear them. They move like cats. You only know they are there when you see the dead men in the morning." The Germans tried to counter this with tripwires and flares. But the Gurkhas were experts at detecting tripwires. They would locate them by touch in the dark, step over them, and continue the stalk. They would bypass the machine gun nests and attack the command posts in the rear. This infiltration tactic destroyed the German command structure. Officers were killed in their beds. Radio lines were cut. The German soldiers began to feel that their bunkers were not sanctuaries, but traps. The arrogant belief in Aryan superiority crumbled when faced with men who could kill them before they even knew they were in a fight. The night of the ears wasn't about taking ground, it was about taking away the German soldier's ability to sleep. And a sleepless soldier is a beaten soldier. The ordeal of the 1st Battalion, 9th Gurkha Rifles on Hangman's Hill is one of the epic stands of World War II. They had captured the rocky outcrop below the monastery, but they were cut off. The Germans realized their mistake and surrounded the hill. They poured fire onto the Gurkhas from the monastery above and the town below. For 9 days, the Gurkhas held out. They were stuck on a bare rock face. They couldn't dig deep foxholes because of the stone. They built shallow tsangas, walls of loose rock. They had no food. They had no water. The Allies tried to resupply them by air. But the drop zone was tiny. Most of the canisters rolled down the cliffs into German hands. The Germans taunted them. "Surrender! You are starving!" The Gurkhas didn't answer with words. They answered with grenades. The fighting was so close that the Germans could throw stick grenades into the Gurkha sangas. But the Gurkhas had quick reflexes. They played a deadly game of cricket. They would catch the German grenades in mid-air, or pick them up before the long fuses burned down, and throw them back. German infantry tried to storm the hill repeatedly. They expected to find weak, starving men. Instead, they were met with a fury of small arms fire and kukris. The Gurkhas refused to yield a single inch of rock. They drank rainwater pooled in the crevices. They rationed their ammunition. When their officer, Colonel Nangle, was asked about the situation, he radioed back, "We are quite happy here, but a little hungry." This stoicism baffled the Germans. The Wehrmacht was a professional army, but it was logical. If a unit was surrounded and starving, logic dictated surrender. The Gurkhas didn't operate on logic. They operated on honor. To surrender was to shame the regiment. So they stayed. They held the hill until the final Allied breakthrough forced the Germans to retreat from the entire Gustav line. When the relief column finally reached them, the Gurkhas were gaunt skeletons. But their rifles were clean, and their kukris were sharp. They marched down the hill in formation, saluting their officers. The Germans had thrown their best paratroopers at Hangman's Hill, and the mountain devils had broken them on the rock. Defending a hill is one thing. Attacking one is another. When the Gurkhas went on the offensive, the Germans heard a sound that froze their blood. "Io Gorkali! The Gurkhas are upon you!" It was a high-pitched, screaming war cry that echoed through the valleys. Unlike the deep hurrah of the Russians or the rebel yell, the Gurkha cry was sharp and piercing. It signaled a charge. And a Gurkha charge was a terrifying spectacle. They didn't stop to fire and maneuver. They ran. They sprinted uphill, ignoring the German machine gun fire, closing the distance as fast as possible. They slung their rifles across their backs. They drew their kukris. To a German soldier, trained to fight at a distance with a Mauser rifle, the sight of a man running at him with a curved knife was unnerving. It triggered a primal fight or flight response. And often, the Germans chose flight. In close quarters, the kukri was devastating. A rifle with a bayonet is long and clumsy in a trench. The kukri is short and fast. The Gurkhas moved like whirlwinds through the German positions. They would duck under a bayonet thrust and strike upward. Or they would leap into a machine gun pit and silence the crew in seconds. The violence was intimate and brutal. German units that had stood firm against artillery barrages broke and ran when they heard the cries "Io Gorkali!" It wasn't just fear of death, it was fear of mutilation. The reputation of the kukri had grown into a myth. German soldiers believed the Gurkhas were cannibals, a lie, but one the Gurkhas didn't mind encouraging. In one battle near San Marino, a single company of Gurkhas routed a German battalion. The Germans reported being attacked by thousands of screaming madmen. In reality, it was only about 100 Gurkhas. But their ferocity made them seem like a legion. The colonial troops had proven that spirit and a sharp blade could defeat superior firepower if you were brave enough to get close. By late 1944, the Germans had retreated to the Gothic Line in the northern Apennines. It was a formidable barrier of concrete bunkers, barbed wire, and minefields strung across mountain peaks that rose 3,000 feet. The German General Kesselring was confident. "The terrain is on our side," he said. He had placed his defenses to cover the roads and the shallow slopes. He left the steep cliffs lightly guarded, believing they were impassable to soldiers carrying heavy weapons. He forgot about the Gurkhas. The 4th Indian Division, with its Gurkha battalions, was assigned to break the line. They looked at the cliffs. They didn't see a barrier. They saw a ladder. Under the cover of a dark, rainy night, the Gurkhas began to climb. They didn't use ropes or pitons. They used their hands and feet. They pulled each other up rock faces that were near vertical. They hauled their Bren guns and mortars up with them, passing them hand to hand. The Germans on the summit were relaxed. They were watching the valley floor, waiting for tanks. They didn't look down the cliff. Why would they? No one could climb that. At 3 a.m., the first Gurkha pulled himself over the lip of the ridge. He was behind the German bunkers. He signaled the others. Silently, hundreds of men filtered into the German rear area. Then, all hell broke loose. The Gurkhas attacked the bunkers from behind. They threw grenades through the rear doors. The Germans woke up to find the enemy inside their perimeter. Panic ensued. The German defensive scheme was designed to fight an enemy coming from the front. They had no plan for an enemy that fell from the sky or climbed from the abyss. The Gothic line, which was supposed to hold for months, was breached in a single night. The German commanders were stunned. They couldn't understand how a force had moved through impossible terrain so quickly. They realized too late that they had judged the Gurkhas by European standards. To a European conscript, a cliff is a wall. To a Nepali Highlander, it's just a steep path. The Gurkhas had simply walked over the German defenses. By September 1944, the German army in Italy was beginning to realize that the concept of a front line no longer applied when fighting the Gurkhas. The village of Tavaleto was supposed to be a secure rear area, miles behind the active fighting of the Gothic line. German officers sat in commandeered farmhouses, eating dinner, studying maps, confident that the war was happening elsewhere. They were wrong. A battalion of the 9th Gurkha Rifles had infiltrated through the German lines at night. They had bypassed the machine gun nests, ignored the roads, and moved cross-country through ravines and thickets that the Germans considered impassable. They moved faster on foot through the rough terrain than the Germans could move on the roads in trucks. They encircled the village in complete silence. Just as the German officers were finishing their meal, the doors crashed open. There was no shouting. No demands for surrender. Just the flash of steel. The violence was sudden and total. A German headquarters was wiped out in minutes by men they thought were 10 miles away. The panic that followed was devastating to German morale. Reports started flooding into General Kesselring's headquarters. Gurkhas are in the rear. We are surrounded. German artillery batteries, positioned to fire on the advancing Allied armies, suddenly found themselves under attack from behind. Gun crews were slaughtered before they could turn their cannons around. Supply trucks driving toward the front were ambushed by Gurkha patrols that melted back into the hills. The Tavaleto surprise proved that the Gurkhas had mastered the art of deep penetration. They didn't just break the line, they dissolved it. For the average German soldier, the realization was terrifying: there was no safe place left in Italy. The mountains had eyes, and the shadows had blades. Racial arrogance is a powerful drug, but reality is a sobering antidote. By late 1944, the sneering disdain that German officers held for the colonial auxiliaries had evaporated. It was replaced by a deep, fearful professional respect. This change in attitude often happened in the German field hospitals. German military doctors were used to treating horrific wounds, shrapnel tears, bullet holes, burns. They were messy, jagged injuries. But when the casualties came in from sectors fighting the Gurkhas, the doctors saw something new. They saw clean amputations. Arms severed at the shoulder in a single smooth cut. Heads nearly removed from bodies. The doctors, hardened men who had seen everything on the Eastern Front, turned pale. They knew that no shell fragment or machine gun bullet caused these wounds. They were the result of a heavy blade, wielded with incredible speed and force. Word spread through the ranks. The Lanzer, German infantryman, realized that the propaganda about primitive inferior troops was a lie that was getting them killed. German intelligence reports began to change their tone. They stopped calling the Gurkhas bandits. They started calling them elite mountain troops and highly dangerous assault infantry. General von Senger and Etterlin, commanding the German 14 Panzer Corps at Cassino, later wrote about the magnificent fighting quality of the Gurkhas. The Germans realized they were facing a warrior caste that was, man for man, tougher than their own vaunted SS paratroopers. They learned to fear the slouch hat more than the steel helmet. The respect was grudging, born of terror, but it was real. The Aryan myth had been shattered by a 5'3" Highlander with a curved knife. The bravery of the Gurkhas was not just a collective unit trait, it was delivered through acts of individual, almost superhuman courage. Throughout the war, Gurkhas earned 2,734 awards for bravery, including 13 Victoria Crosses, the highest award in the British Empire. In Italy, the fighting produced moments that defied belief. During the assault on the Gothic line, a young Noric, Corporal Agonsing Rai, found his platoon pinned down by 2 German machine gun nests situated on a ridge. The fire was withering. Men were dying around him. The advance had stopped. Rai realized that if they stayed there, they would all die. He didn't order his men to charge. He charged alone. He ran straight up the slope toward the first German bunker, firing his Tommy gun. Bullets kicked up the dirt around his feet, but he didn't stop. He reached the bunker, threw in a grenade, and followed it with bursts of submachine gun fire. The crew was silenced. But the second machine gun was still firing. Without pausing, Agonsing Rai turned and charged the second position across open ground. It was suicide. But the German gunners, perhaps stunned by the sheer audacity of this lone figure, hesitated for a split second. It was enough. Rai reached the second nest and silenced it. He had single-handedly destroyed 2 fortified machine gun positions and killed 4 Germans. His actions broke the deadlock, and his platoon swept forward to take the ridge. This was not an isolated incident. It was typical of the Gurkha fighting spirit. When faced with an impossible obstacle, the Gurkha response was to attack it head-on with overwhelming aggression. They didn't wait for tanks or artillery. They took matters into their own hands, often paying the ultimate price, but always taking the objective. When the war in Italy ended in May 1945, the German army surrendered. As the long columns of defeated German troops marched into captivity, they would often pass the men who had broken their lines. The Germans, tall and sullen, would look sideways at the small, cheerful Gurkhas polishing their kits by the roadside. The Germans no longer scoffed. They looked with the wary eyes of men who had survived an encounter with a predator. The Gurkhas had played a pivotal role in the Italian campaign. They had cracked the toughest fortresses of the Gustav Line. They had scaled the impossible cliffs of the Gothic Line. They had terrified the Wehrmacht in the night. They had done the jobs that machines couldn't do, and that other infantry wouldn't do. The German commanders who had ignored them at the beginning of the campaign had learned a brutal lesson in the realities of warfare. You do not judge a warrior by his height or his race. You judge him by his heart and his blade. The legacy of the Gurkhas in World War II is immortalized in a quote often attributed to the Indian Army Chief of Staff. If a man says he is not afraid of dying, he is either lying or he is a Gurkha. They were, simply put, the bravest of the brave. And on the bloody slopes of Monte Cassino and the rugged peaks of the Apennines, they proved that a few blades, in the right hands, could indeed change the course of an entire war.